What made you finally call the cops on your own brother? Mom called me from the hospital at 3 in the morning screaming that Aunt Linda was dead. Not sick. Not declining. Dead. She'd been fine last week when I'd visited her at Greenfield Senior Living, the facility my brother Caleb owned and operated. Mom kept saying the hospital couldn't explain why Linda had been so dehydrated her organs had shut down, why there were bed sores on her back that looked weeks old, why her medications hadn't been administered properly in days. I drove to the hospital in my pajamas with my hands shaking on the wheel. Linda was only 68 and had moved into Caleb's facility 6 months ago for mild memory issues and arthritis management. Nothing that should have killed her. The ER doctor showed me photos they'd taken during examination. Linda's bed sores were stage 4, exposing bone in some places. Her medical chart from Greenfield showed she'd been bedridden for 3 days with stomach flu, but the deterioration suggested weeks of neglect. The toxicology report showed she hadn't received her blood pressure medication in at least 5 days, despite the facility's records indicating daily administration. Someone had been falsifying documents. The doctor asked if I knew who was responsible for Linda's care. I told him my brother owned the place and personally oversaw operations. The doctor's expression shifted to something careful and measured. He said he was required to report this to Adult Protective Services and the medical examiner. Mom wouldn't stop crying in the waiting room. She kept saying there must be some mistake because Caleb had promised Linda would receive excellent care. He'd given Mom a family discount and assured her that Linda would be treated like royalty. Mom had believed him because he was her son and had been running Greenfield for 3 years with glowing reviews online. I'd believed him too when I'd toured the facility. Everything had looked clean and professional with attentive staff and happy residents. But now Linda was dead, and the evidence suggested she'd been neglected so badly it constituted criminal abuse. I called Caleb at 4 in the morning. He answered sounding groggy and annoyed until I told him about Linda. Then his voice changed completely. He said, "What do you mean she's dead? She was fine yesterday during rounds." I asked him about the bed sores and the missed medications. He went quiet for a long moment before saying he'd need to review her chart and talk to the night staff. He said sometimes residents declined faster than anyone expected, and maybe Linda had hidden the extent of her condition. His explanation sounded rehearsed somehow, too smooth for someone who'd just learned about a resident's death. I told him the hospital was calling Adult Protective Services. He hung up without responding. Adult Protective Services investigator Veronica Wright arrived at the hospital 2 hours later. She was maybe 50 with salt and pepper hair and the exhausted eyes of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. She interviewed Mom and me separately, taking detailed notes about Linda's condition before entering Greenfield and the timeline of her decline. She asked about Caleb's ownership and management practices. I told her he'd bought the facility 3 years ago after working as a hospital administrator. He'd seemed passionate about providing quality elder care and had convinced our whole family to invest in his business. Aunt Linda was the 4th family member placed there. Veronica's pen stopped moving when I said 4th. She asked if I could provide names and contact information for the other 3 family members at Greenfield. I listed our Uncle Raymond, our cousin's grandmother Alice, and our great-aunt Dorothy. Veronica wrote down each name and asked when I'd last visited them. I'd seen Raymond 2 weeks ago, and he'd seemed fine. Alice I hadn't visited in a month, but she'd called me last week sounding cheerful. Dorothy I'd visited 3 weeks ago, and she'd been in good spirits, showing me her knitting projects. Veronica asked if any of them had complained about care quality. Raymond had mentioned the food being cold sometimes. Alice said the staff seemed rushed and distracted. Dorothy had joked that sometimes she had to wait hours for someone to help her to the bathroom. I dismissed these as minor complaints that probably happened at every facility. Veronica said she was opening an immediate investigation into Greenfield and would be conducting surprise inspections. She asked if I'd be willing to provide a formal statement about Linda's condition and any concerns about the facility's operations. I said yes, even though it meant potentially implicating my own brother in criminal negligence. Mom grabbed my arm and whispered that I shouldn't say anything that might hurt Caleb. She said we needed to support family during difficult times, not tear them down. But I kept seeing those photos of Linda's bed sores and thinking about how much pain she must have been in while Caleb's staff falsified records claiming she was receiving excellent care. The medical examiner classified Linda's death as suspicious pending autopsy results. Greenfield would remain open during the investigation, but APS would be monitoring closely. I drove Mom home and she didn't speak to me the entire ride. When I pulled up to her house, she finally said, "You're going to destroy your brother over an accident. Linda was old and sick. These things happen." I told her Linda was 68 and had been healthy enough to live independently until 6 months ago. Mom got out without responding and slammed the door hard enough that my car shook. I couldn't sleep that day, so I drove to Greenfield around noon. The facility looked the same as always from outside, a nice converted mansion with well-maintained gardens and cheerful paint. The lobby was empty except for a young receptionist who barely looked up when I signed in to visit Raymond. The hallways smelled wrong, though. Not the usual antiseptic cleanser, but something stale and neglected underneath the air freshener. Raymond's room was on the 2nd floor, and I found him sitting in his wheelchair by the window wearing yesterday's clothes. He looked surprised to see me and asked if it was already visiting day. I said I'd just come to check on him after Linda's death. His face went pale. He said, "Linda died? When?" Raymond hadn't been told about Linda's death even though she'd been at the facility for months and they'd become friends. He said he hadn't seen any staff since breakfast and that had been just crackers and juice, not a real meal. His medications were sitting on the dresser untouched even though he was supposed to receive them with meals. His room hadn't been cleaned in days based on the accumulation of dust and the overflowing trash can. I asked where the nursing staff was and Raymond shrugged. He said they were always disappearing for hours at a time and some days there was only one person covering the entire second floor. That couldn't be right. Caleb had told us he maintained proper staffing ratios and hired experienced nurses. I walked down the hall checking other rooms. Most were empty because residents were supposedly at activities or therapy sessions. But I found 3 elderly people alone in their rooms looking confused or sleeping in the middle of the day. One woman was calling weekly for help, saying she needed to use the bathroom. I found a staff member finally on the first floor chatting on her phone. I asked why there were residents needing assistance upstairs, and she rolled her eyes. She said she was on break and the charge nurse would handle it when she got back from the pharmacy run. I asked how many staff were currently on duty, and she said just her and one other aide for 32 residents because 2 people had called in sick. That couldn't be legal. I'd researched elder care regulations when Linda first moved in, and facilities were required to maintain minimum staffing ratios for resident safety. 2 aides for 32 residents was dangerously inadequate. I went back upstairs and helped the woman to the bathroom myself because she was clearly in distress. Her name was Margaret, and she was crying with relief and humiliation. She said this happened all the time now because there weren't enough staff and the ones working were overwhelmed. She'd been ringing her call button for over an hour with no response. I asked if she'd told her family about the staffing problems. Margaret said she'd tried, but her daughter lived out of state and thought Margaret was exaggerating because the facility had such good online reviews. I found Alice in the activities room alone watching television. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her and her hair looked unwashed. She was happy to see me but seemed confused about what day it was. I asked if she'd been eating properly and she said the meals were small and often cold by the time they arrived. Sometimes they forgot to bring her tray entirely and she'd go to bed hungry. The activities director rarely showed up anymore, so residents just sat in front of the TV all day. Alice said she'd tried calling her granddaughter to complain, but the facility's phone system was broken and they wouldn't let her use her cell phone during the day. When I asked why not, Alice said the staff had told her it was a rule to prevent confusion among memory care residents. That was a lie. I'd reviewed the resident handbook and there was no such policy. The staff was deliberately isolating residents from their families to prevent complaints. I took Alice's cell phone from her dresser and checked the settings. The facility's Wi-Fi network was available but required a password that Alice didn't have. Without Wi-Fi, her phone couldn't make calls because the building's thick walls blocked cellular signal. I connected her to the Wi-Fi using the guest password I'd been given during my initial tour, and immediately her phone lit up with missed calls and text messages from her worried granddaughter. Alice started crying when she saw how many times her family had tried to reach her. Dorothy was in worse shape. I found her in bed at 2 in the afternoon, still in her nightgown, looking weak and disoriented. Her room was hot and stuffy with the window closed despite the nice weather outside. She recognized me but seemed confused about where she was. I asked when she'd last eaten and she said she couldn't remember. Her breakfast tray was sitting untouched on the dresser because no one had helped her sit up to eat it. Dorothy had limited mobility and couldn't feed herself without assistance. The cold oatmeal and juice had been sitting there for hours while Dorothy lay in bed hungry and alone. I helped her sit up and held the juice cup while she drank. She gulped it desperately, and I realized she was severely dehydrated just like Linda had been. I called Veronica Wright immediately and told her what I'd found. She said she was already on her way to Greenfield for the surprise inspection and would be there within the hour. I should stay with the residents and document everything I was seeing. I went room by room on the second floor taking photos and notes. Out of 15 occupied rooms, I found 12 residents who'd been neglected in some way. Missed medications, uneaten meals, full diapers that hadn't been changed, call buttons unplugged. One man had fallen trying to get to the bathroom himself and was lying on the floor unable to get up. He said he'd been there for 30 minutes calling for help. Veronica arrived with 2 other investigators and they immediately began documenting violations. The staffing shortage was just the beginning. Medication logs were falsified showing administered doses that clearly hadn't been given. Food service records claimed 3 full meals daily, but the kitchen showed minimal recent activity. Cleaning schedules were fabricated. The required safety checks hadn't been conducted in weeks. Veronica's team found 13 residents in immediate medical distress requiring hospitalization. Raymond was dehydrated and malnourished. Dorothy was in acute kidney failure from lack of fluids. Margaret had a urinary tract infection that had progressed to sepsis from sitting in soiled clothes for hours. The paramedics arrived and started triaging residents for emergency transport. The single staff member on duty started crying and saying she'd been doing her best, but corporate kept cutting her hours and refusing to hire enough people. She said Caleb had fired 3 experienced nurses last month to save money and replaced them with minimum wage aides who had no medical training. He'd been skimming funds from the operating budget while maintaining the illusion of quality care through falsified records and manipulated online reviews. Staff members who complained about safety concerns were fired immediately. The aide said she'd been planning to quit but needed the job to pay rent. Caleb arrived an hour later looking frantic. He saw the ambulances and investigators and his face went white. Veronica intercepted him in the lobby and told him the facility was being placed under emergency suspension. All residents would be relocated to proper care facilities within 48 hours. Criminal charges were being referred to the district attorney for elder abuse, fraud, and criminally negligent homicide in Linda's death. Caleb started arguing that this was a misunderstanding and he'd fix any deficiencies immediately. Veronica told him he was being served with cease and desist orders and needed to contact his attorney. Caleb looked at me standing behind Veronica, and his expression shifted to pure rage. He said, "You called them. You're destroying me because of one mistake." I told him Linda's death wasn't a mistake, and neither were the 13 residents being hospitalized for neglect-related emergencies. He'd been systematically defrauding vulnerable elderly people while starving and neglecting them to maximize his profits. Caleb's face twisted, and he said I'd always been jealous of his success, that I couldn't stand seeing him build something while I worked my boring middle management job. He said family was supposed to protect each other, and I'd betrayed him by siding with strangers over my own brother. I told him he'd betrayed every person who'd trusted him with their loved one's care. Mom called me that evening screaming that I'd ruined Caleb's life over exaggerated complaints from senile old people. She'd heard about the investigation and facility closure from Caleb, who'd told her I'd orchestrated everything to hurt him. Mom said Linda's death was a tragic accident and the other residents were fine, but I was making problems where none existed. I asked if 13 people hospitalized for severe neglect sounded fine to her. She said the investigators were probably overstating things and Caleb would prove he'd done nothing wrong. I asked when Mom had last actually visited any of the family members at Greenfield instead of just accepting Caleb's reassurances. She went quiet and then hung up. The autopsy results came back 3 days later. Linda had died from multi-organ failure caused by severe dehydration and malnutrition. The medical examiner found evidence of prolonged neglect, including the stage 4 bed sores, multiple untreated infections, and dangerous medication gaps. The report stated that Linda had likely been suffering for weeks before her death, and that immediate medical intervention could have prevented her death. The toxicology screening showed she hadn't received several critical medications for at least 10 days despite facility records claiming daily administration. The medical examiner classified the death as homicide by criminal negligence. The district attorney's office opened a criminal investigation into Greenfield and Caleb personally. Lead prosecutor Diana Reeves called me for an interview, and I spent 4 hours describing everything I'd witnessed. She said they were building cases for multiple felony charges including elder abuse, fraud, falsifying medical records, and criminally negligent homicide. The investigation had uncovered that Caleb had been running this operation for over 2 years, systematically cutting costs while charging premium prices and pocketing the difference. He'd stolen an estimated $800,000 from resident care funds while maintaining the facade of a luxury facility. Diana said they'd found evidence that Caleb had been bribing the state health inspector to overlook violations during annual inspections. The inspector had been receiving monthly cash payments in exchange for advance notice of inspections and falsified compliance reports. That explained how Greenfield had maintained perfect ratings while providing such abysmal care. Caleb had been smart enough to stage the facility before scheduled inspections, bringing in temporary staff and cleaning everything up to create the illusion of proper operations. Then he'd return to skeleton crews and neglect immediately afterward. The whole operation had been a calculated fraud designed to exploit families desperate for affordable quality care. The other families started coming forward with their own stories of neglect and abuse. Margaret's daughter described how her mother had lost 30 pounds in 4 months at Greenfield, but Caleb had dismissed it as normal aging. Alice's granddaughter had filed complaints about missed medication doses, but Caleb had blamed Alice's memory issues and claimed she was confused about her schedule. Raymond's son had noticed his father becoming increasingly withdrawn and lethargic, but Caleb had insisted it was depression from aging and recommended expensive psychiatric medications. Every concern had been explained away or blamed on the residents themselves while Caleb continued profiting from their suffering. The financial investigation revealed that Caleb had diverted resident care funds into his personal accounts and luxury purchases. While residents ate crackers and juice, he'd bought a boat and a vacation home. While he cut nursing staff to skeleton crews, he'd taken international vacations and purchased a sports car. The evidence showed premeditated theft and abuse spanning years with dozens of victims. Diana said they were identifying at least 40 residents who'd been systematically defrauded and neglected during Caleb's ownership. Some had died under suspicious circumstances that were originally attributed to natural causes, but now warranted re-examination. My family fractured over the investigation. Mom stopped speaking to me entirely and told relatives I was a traitor destroying Caleb's life over lies. My uncle sided with Mom, saying I should have handled things privately within the family instead of involving authorities. But Raymond's son thanked me for saving his father's life. Alice's granddaughter said I'd prevented her grandmother from dying the same way Linda had. Dorothy's daughter came to my house and hugged me while crying, saying she'd noticed her mother declining but had trusted Caleb's explanations until it was almost too late. The family divided between those who prioritized protecting Caleb and those who recognized he'd committed serious crimes against vulnerable people. Caleb hired an expensive defense attorney named Richard Frost, who immediately started attacking the investigation's credibility. Frost held press conferences claiming the charges were based on exaggerated complaints from confused elderly people and vindictive family members. He said Caleb was being persecuted for one tragic death that resulted from Linda's underlying health conditions, not neglect. Frost painted me as a jealous sibling with a grudge who'd manipulated investigators. He implied the hospitalized residents had been coached to provide false statements, and the facility violations were minor paperwork issues being blown out of proportion. But Diana had the medical records and financial evidence that contradicted every defense claim. She had testimony from staff members who'd witnessed the neglect and been threatened into silence. She had the falsified medication logs and the proof of bribery. She had autopsy results and expert testimony about the systematic nature of the abuse. The case was airtight despite Frost's attempts to muddy the waters. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and Diana said she was confident about securing an indictment. I attended the preliminary hearing and sat in the gallery watching Caleb's attorney try to dismantle the prosecution's case. Frost argued that the facility staffing shortages resulted from the difficulty of hiring qualified workers in a competitive market, not intentional cost-cutting. He claimed the falsified records were administrative errors by undertrained staff, not deliberate fraud. He suggested Linda's death was an unfortunate outcome of her underlying health conditions that would have killed her regardless of care quality. Frost painted Caleb as a dedicated care provider overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. Then Diana presented the financial records showing Caleb's systematic theft. She showed his luxury purchases made with money that should have funded resident care. She presented testimony from the fired nurses who'd complained about dangerous conditions and been terminated. She played recorded phone calls where Caleb had instructed staff to falsify medication logs and hide violations from inspectors. She showed the bribery payments to the health inspector documented in bank records. By the time she finished, Frost's narrative had collapsed completely. The judge found probable cause for all charges and scheduled trial for 4 months later. Caleb was released on bail with strict conditions, including surrendering his medical administrator license and having no contact with former Greenfield residents or staff. He moved back in with Mom, who welcomed him while continuing to refuse my calls. My siblings were split, with 2 supporting me and 1 backing Caleb. Family gatherings became impossible because the conflict was too intense. I lost relationships I'd valued my entire life because I'd chosen to protect vulnerable elderly people over protecting my brother's criminal enterprise. The investigation expanded as more victims came forward. Families of deceased former residents requested autopsy reviews for relatives who died at Greenfield during Caleb's ownership. The medical examiner's office identified 7 additional suspicious deaths that warranted investigation. 3 showed signs of severe dehydration similar to Linda. 2 had untreated infections that progressed to sepsis. 1 had fallen and suffered head trauma, but wasn't taken to the hospital for 12 hours despite showing obvious signs of concussion. Another had been given the wrong medication for weeks, causing a fatal drug interaction. Each death had been classified as natural at the time, but the pattern suggested systematic neglect. Diana added wrongful death charges for 3 of the cases where evidence was strongest. The families of those victims joined Linda's case in a coordinated prosecution. I testified at depositions describing what I'd witnessed and how Caleb had deceived our family about Greenfield's operations. Defense attorneys tried to paint me as unreliable because of my family connection and supposed bias against Caleb, but my testimony was corroborated by dozens of staff members, medical experts, and documentary evidence. The financial records alone proved Caleb had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from resident care budgets. The civil lawsuits started piling up. Families filed wrongful death suits and elder abuse claims seeking damages for the suffering their loved ones had endured. The total claims exceeded $15 million, but Greenfield's insurance only covered $2 million. Caleb's personal assets were frozen pending resolution of the criminal case. His vacation home and boat were seized. His business accounts were locked. He'd built his wealth on stolen money and suffering, and now it was being systematically dismantled. Mom mortgaged her house to help pay Caleb's legal fees, which infuriated my siblings who tried to stop her. The family warfare intensified as the financial reality of Caleb's crimes became clear. I started volunteering with an elder advocacy group that Diana connected me with. They helped families navigate the complex system of reporting abuse and seeking accountability. I shared my story about missing the warning signs and believing Caleb's lies despite evidence something was wrong. Other families described similar experiences of trusting facility operators who turned out to be exploiting their loved ones. The common thread was sophisticated manipulation by operators who knew how to game the inspection system and deflect complaints. Systemic failures allowed people like Caleb to abuse vulnerable populations for years before being caught. The trial began on a cold morning in November. The courtroom was packed with victims' families and media covering the case. Caleb sat at the defense table looking thinner and older than I remembered. Mom sat in the front row behind him, refusing to look at me, sitting on the prosecution's side. The jury selection took 3 days as Frost tried to eliminate anyone who'd had elderly relatives in care facilities. Diana countered by emphasizing the need for jurors who understood the vulnerability of elder care residents and the sacred trust that operators held. The prosecution's case took 2 weeks. Diana methodically presented evidence of each element of fraud and abuse. Medical examiners testified about the preventable nature of the deaths. Forensic accountants detailed the stolen funds and personal enrichment. Former staff members described being ordered to falsify records and hide violations. The fired nurses explained how they'd reported dangerous conditions and been terminated for speaking up. Family members testified about watching their loved ones deteriorate while Caleb provided reassurances and excuses. The accumulation of evidence was overwhelming and devastating. I testified on day 8. Diana walked me through discovering Linda's condition, and then finding the widespread neglect during my visit. I described Caleb's reaction when confronted and his attempts to blame others. I explained how he'd manipulated our family's trust to place vulnerable relatives in a facility he knew was providing inadequate care. Frost's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested I was jealous of Caleb's business success and had fabricated concerns to destroy him. He implied I was seeking attention and playing the hero at my brother's expense. But I stayed calm and repeated the facts about what I'd witnessed and the evidence that supported it. The defense case was weak. Frost tried to blame the staff for poor performance and claim Caleb had been unaware of the problems. He suggested the financial records were misleading and Caleb's withdrawals were legitimate business expenses. He brought character witnesses who testified about Caleb's dedication to elder care and his reputation in the community. But none of it could overcome the documented evidence of systematic fraud and abuse. The bribery payments to the health inspector alone proved deliberate criminal intent. The falsified medication logs showed knowing participation in covering up neglect. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Caleb was convicted of criminally negligent homicide in 4 deaths, elder abuse affecting 40 residents, fraud, falsifying medical records, and bribery. Mom started sobbing when the verdicts were read. Caleb sat motionless, staring at the table. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and remanded Caleb to custody without bail. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, he looked directly at me with an expression of absolute hatred. Mom rushed from the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Sentencing day brought all the victims' families to court for impact statements. Raymond's son described watching his father nearly die from dehydration and malnutrition while paying premium prices for quality care. Alice's granddaughter talked about her grandmother's terror and confusion during those final months at Greenfield. Margaret's daughter explained how her mother still suffered nightmares about being left alone and helpless. Dorothy's family described their ongoing grief and anger about the preventable suffering their mother had endured. Linda's family was represented by Mom, but she refused to give a statement against Caleb. The judge spent 30 minutes detailing Caleb's crimes before pronouncing sentence. She noted the systematic nature of the abuse, the number of victims, the deliberate deception, and the complete lack of remorse Caleb had shown throughout the proceedings. She emphasized that Caleb had held a position of sacred trust as a care provider and had betrayed that trust in the most egregious way possible for personal profit. She sentenced him to 28 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 14 years. Additional sentences for the fraud and bribery charges would run concurrently. Caleb would be nearly 70 before he could seek release. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt exhausted and sad rather than triumphant. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo Linda's death or the suffering of 40 other victims. My family was fractured, probably permanently. Mom still blamed me for destroying Caleb's life instead of recognizing that he'd destroyed it himself through his own criminal choices. Some siblings understood why I'd acted, but others had sided with Mom and cut me off completely. The cost of doing the right thing had been higher than I'd imagined that morning when I'd first seen Linda's autopsy photos. The civil lawsuits settled over the next year. Caleb's seized assets and the insurance policy were distributed among the victims' families. It wasn't enough to compensate for the suffering and deaths, but it provided some financial recognition of the harm. Several families used their settlements to fund elder advocacy organizations. Margaret's daughter started a foundation that provided free legal assistance to families reporting abuse in care facilities. Alice's granddaughter created an inspection oversight program that conducted surprise facility visits to supplement inadequate state monitoring. Raymond's son lobbied for stronger criminal penalties for elder abuse. I continued volunteering with the elder advocacy group, speaking about the warning signs I'd missed and the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. Many people felt guilty about placing relatives in facilities and feared they'd miss abuse the way I initially had. I emphasized that sophisticated operators like Caleb were skilled manipulators who created elaborate facades to hide their crimes. The responsibility for abuse lay with the abusers, not the families who trusted them. But we all had a duty to remain vigilant and report concerns immediately, rather than accepting explanations that didn't quite add up. 3 years after Caleb's conviction, Mom finally agreed to meet me for coffee. She looked older and tired, worn down by the weight of defending someone who'd been proven guilty beyond any doubt. She said she'd been visiting Caleb in prison, and he'd finally admitted some of what he'd done. Not everything, but enough that Mom could no longer maintain the fiction that he'd been wrongly convicted. She apologized for blaming me and said she understood why I'd called the authorities that day. It didn't heal everything between us, but it was a start toward rebuilding some kind of relationship. Linda's grave had become a gathering place for families of Greenfield's victims. Someone had placed a small memorial plaque listing the names of the residents who died from Caleb's neglect. I visited on the anniversary of her death and found flowers and notes from people who'd never met Linda but felt connected to her story. One note said, "Thank you for having a niece brave enough to seek justice." Another said, "Your death exposed evil and saved lives." I think Linda would appreciate knowing that her suffering hadn't been meaningless, that it had sparked changes protecting other vulnerable elderly people from similar abuse. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.